The first time it happened, he told himself it meant nothing. He was standing in an airport in Dubai, a place he had passed through perhaps 200 times across a career that had required the kind of continuous, exhausting, international movement that most people experience once or twice in a lifetime, and that had become, for him, simply the texture of being alive, the background noise of a life lived at altitude. Standing in the private terminal with his bag over his shoulder and his phone in his hand, in the particular posture of a man who is between one place and another and has briefly, in the gap between arrivals and departures, stopped performing anything for anyone. The terminal was quiet. 3 other people, none of them paying attention to him, none of them looking up from their own phones or their own exhaustion or their own private negotiations with the specific tedium of waiting. He walked to the coffee counter. The attendant looked up. Young, 20, perhaps 22, with the polished, professionally warm expression of someone trained to make high-net-worth travelers feel welcomed rather than processed. She looked at him the way service professionals look at people they are about to serve, with a readiness that is attentive without being personal, that sees the customer rather than the person. And then nothing, no shift in the expression. No small involuntary widening of the eyes that he had learned over 30 years to anticipate in exactly this kind of proximity. The recognition response, the specific microsecond of adjustment that happened in people's faces when the name and the face and the physical reality of him assembled themselves into a fact their brain was processing, the moment where the stranger became not a stranger but a noun, a category, a phenomenon they had been aware of for years and were now, unexpectedly, standing 2 feet away from. He had been reading that response his entire adult life. He knew its texture. He knew the difference between it and its absence. Its absence was here. She asked him what he would like. He told her. She made it. He paid. She thanked him with the same professionally warm smile and moved to the next task, and he walked away with his coffee and stood by the window looking out at the planes on the tarmac and told himself it meant nothing, that she was young and probably didn't follow football, and that the absence of recognition in a single airport attendant in a private terminal in Dubai was not data, was not evidence of anything, was not the beginning of anything. He told himself this very thoroughly. He told himself this in the way that you tell yourself things very thoroughly, specifically, when you suspect they might not be entirely true. To understand the fear, you have to understand what the recognition had meant. Not what he said it meant, not the official version, the carefully managed answer he had given in 100 interviews when the question of fame arrived, as it always arrived, as it was always going to arrive in any conversation about his life, the answer that was approximately, "It is humbling. It is something I feel a responsibility toward. I try never to take it for granted. It belongs to the fans rather than to me." All of that was true. All of that was also incomplete. All of that was the version, which was always true and always incomplete, always accurate in its broad outlines and always missing the specific, unglamorous, privately held reality underneath. The reality underneath was this. The recognition had been, for 30 years, the primary external evidence that the thing was real, that the work had produced something permanent, that the boy from Madeira, who had sat on a bathroom floor in Carrington and on the steps of a Lisbon dormitory and in a hospital corridor in Funchal had become 100 interviews when the question of fame arrived, as it always arrived, as it was always going to arrive in any conversation about his life, the answer that was approximately, "It is humbling. It is something I feel a responsibility toward. I try never to take it for granted. It belongs to the fans rather than to me." All of that was true. All of that was also incomplete. All of that was the version, which was always true and always incomplete, always accurate in its broad outlines and always missing the specific, unglamorous, privately held reality underneath. The reality underneath was this. The recognition had been, for 30 years, the primary external evidence that the thing was real, that the work had produced something permanent, that the boy from Madeira, who had sat on a bathroom floor in Carrington and on the steps of a Lisbon dormitory and in a hospital corridor in Funchal had become, through an accumulation of mornings and decisions and refusals to stop, something that existed in the world independently of him, something that would still be there even in the rooms where he wasn't, that had left a mark on the world that the world was carrying, that had changed the shape of something permanent and recognizable and larger than any individual performance. Every time a face changed at the sight of him, in an airport or a restaurant or a hotel lobby or a city street, that change was a small, daily, continuous piece of evidence. Evidence that the thing existed. Evidence that it had happened. Evidence that the 30 years of cost, the loneliness and the early mornings and the wait that didn't diminish and the question that didn't get answered and the price of the number one, paid daily, invisibly, without receipt, that all of that had produced something real, something that lived in other people's minds and memories, and that was therefore not entirely at the mercy of time or injury or the ordinary human processes of decline that he could feel, with increasing precision and increasing unease, beginning their patient work on the machine he had built his life around maintaining. He had never said this to anyone. It was not the kind of thing that fit in the interviews. It was not even the kind of thing that fit easily in his own thoughts, arriving as it did with the specific discomfort of a truth that reveals a dependency you would prefer not to have, a need that doesn't belong in the version of yourself as self-sufficient, self-generating, internally resourced to a degree that renders external validation not just unnecessary, but beside the point. He was supposed to be beyond needing the recognition. He was supposed to be, at this stage, at this level, after this much, the kind of person whose sense of their own reality was entirely internally maintained, who required nothing from the outside world to confirm what the inside world already knew. He was supposed to be that person. The airport attendant in Dubai had introduced the first small, quiet, completely deniable suggestion that he might not entirely be. The second time happened 3 months later. He was at a charity event in Lisbon, a formal dinner, the kind he attended several times a year, in the specific capacity of someone whose presence at these things serves a function that is not entirely about the cause and not entirely unrelated to it either, whose name on the invitation list changes the quality of attention the event receives, who is there as himself, and also as the thing his name means, doing the work of being Cristiano Ronaldo at a table in a hotel ballroom in the city where his career began, in the city where a 17-year-old boy first understood that what he could do with a ball was not ordinary and was not going to lead to an ordinary life. The event was full of the usual mixture of genuine commitment and social performance that charity dinners tend to contain, with a quality of conversation that oscillated between the meaningful and the decorative, without always being clear about which was which. He was seated beside a man he didn't know, a tech entrepreneur, recently wealthy in the specific way of people who have arrived at money through the routes that the current century has made available, with the confidence of someone whose frame of reference is recent enough that the things that preceded it feel distant and historical rather than foundational. They talked. The conversation was pleasant in the way that conversations between people who have nothing particular in common can be pleasant when both parties are making a genuine effort, moving across surfaces without going deep, finding the shared language of success and ambition, and the specific vocabulary of people who have done things in the world. At some point the man said, in the casual tone of someone making conversation rather than a point, "So you played football? Professionally?" Ronaldo looked at him. "Yes," he said. "Good career?" The question sat in the air between them with a quality that was almost physical, that had a weight that the man who had asked it was entirely unaware of, that pressed against something in Ronaldo's chest in a way he was careful not to let reach his face. He looked at the man who was looking back with the open, curious, entirely uncomplicated expression of someone who genuinely did not know, who had genuinely arrived at this table without the information that most of the tables in most of the rooms in most of the world had always contained, who was asking as one person asks another when they are trying to understand what the other person does, and he felt something that he would not have been able to name cleanly, that was too layered for a single word, that contained elements of several things that were not comfortable to hold simultaneously. "Yes," Ronaldo said. "Good career." The man nodded, interested. "What position?" And Ronaldo, who had answered this question thousands of times, in dozens of languages, in press conferences and documentary interviews and casual conversations and formal ceremonies and every conceivable context that the previous 30 years had produced, answered it again, in the same even voice, with no indication that the answering of it in this particular room to this particular person was anything other than ordinary. He drove home after the dinner in the specific silence that had become familiar to him, the silence that was not restful but occupied, that contained the particular quality of a thought that was not yet fully formed and was making itself known through its effects rather than its content, a low-level pressure, a resistance to the ordinary flow of the evening's end, the sense of something waiting for him in the quiet that he hadn't finished thinking through. He sat in his car in the driveway for 11 minutes before going inside. He was not thinking about the tech entrepreneur specifically. The tech entrepreneur was not the point. The tech entrepreneur was just the most recent data point in a trend that he had been declining to call a trend, refusing to aggregate into a pattern, insisting on treating as a series of isolated incidents rather than evidence of a direction, the direction that he had been aware of as a theoretical future possibility for years, and that appeared to be, with a quietness that he was finding more unsettling than any dramatic confrontation would have been, beginning to become the present. The world was beginning to not know who he was. Not all of it. Not quickly. Not in the way that made headlines or produced the kind of clear external confirmation that would have allowed him to process it as an event rather than a process. Just at the edges. Just in the rooms where the floor was softest. Just in the faces of people who were young enough that their frame of reference didn't include the years when the thing he had built was at its most visible, its most undeniable, its most impossible to not know about if you were paying any attention at all to the world. The edges were moving inward. He knew this. He had always known this was coming. He had known it in the abstract, theoretical way that people know that things will end, with a certainty that exists in the mind without ever quite becoming real in the body, without ever acquiring the specific weight of felt knowledge that transforms a fact from something you understand into something you live. He had understood it. He had not felt it. Not until Dubai. Not until the charity dinner. Not until the specific texture of the absence of recognition had begun to teach him what the presence of it had been doing, what structural work it had been performing in the architecture of his days, what it had been keeping standing. He got out of the car. He went inside. He lay in the dark and felt the fear, felt it clearly for perhaps the first time, without the management, without the version, without the wall between the feeling and his awareness of it, felt it as the thing it actually was, which was not the fear of being forgotten by the general public in the statistical sense of declining recognition, not the fear of the trophy count being exceeded or the records being broken or the argument being settled in the other direction. It was more specific than that. More personal than that. It was the fear of the thing, becoming the past, of the work, the 30 years of work, the continuous, exhausting, total commitment to the work, passing from the category of living fact into the category of historical record, from something the world was currently carrying into something the world had once carried and had put down and was now relating to at the distance of retrospect, with the flattening and the simplification and the loss of texture that retrospect always performs on the things it receives. He was afraid of becoming a name in a book. He was afraid of the present tense becoming the past tense. He was afraid of the day when the sentence Cristiano Ronaldo is the greatest became, without announcement or ceremony or any moment he could point to and say, there, that is when it changed, became Cristiano Ronaldo was. He started watching after that. Not obsessively, or not at first, not in a way that would have been obvious to anyone observing him, not in a way that interfered with the training or the matches or the professional conduct of a life that continued to be, by any external standard, extraordinary. He watched in the way that people watch when they are gathering data they haven't admitted to themselves they are gathering, when the watching is both deliberate and deniable, when you could explain it as curiosity rather than fear if anyone asked, and no one did because no one knew to ask. He watched the faces. In the airports and the hotels and the restaurants and the public appearances that continued to be part of the structure of his days, he watched for the recognition response, cataloged its presence and its absence, noted the age distribution of the people who had it and the people who didn't, and felt, in the privacy of the noticing, the specific sensation of a trend becoming undeniable, of the data accumulating past the point where isolated incidents was a sustainable interpretation. Younger faces, less often. The response that had been universal for 25 years was becoming, at its edges, demographic. The people for whom he was a fact of the world, a given, a constant, one of the things that was simply true about the landscape they had grown up in, those people were getting older. And the people who were replacing them at the young end of the distribution, who were growing up in a world where the peak had passed, where the record books had his name, but the current conversation was beginning to be about other names, other faces, other players who were doing what he had once done with the quality of newness and urgency that only the present tense provides. Those people were looking at him with a different quality of attention. Not without recognition, Not yet, not entirely. The name was still the name, the noun was still the noun, but with the specific quality of looking at something historical rather than something current, the way you look at a monument rather than an event, with respect that has lost its urgency, with knowledge that has lost its heat. He noticed all of this with a precision that he brought to everything he measured, and he felt it with an intensity that surprised him, that arrived in stronger doses than the level of threat he could rationally identify seemed to justify, because the career was still happening, the matches were still being played, the goals were still being scored, the name was still everywhere it had always been. The version of Cristiano Ronaldo that existed in the world was still recognizable and current, and very far from the past tense, rationally, objectively, by every external measure. But the fear was not rational. That was the thing about this specific fear that made it so difficult to manage with the tools he had spent 30 years developing for the management of difficulty, which were tools built on rationality and discipline, and the construction of a clear relationship between effort and outcome, between the work you do and the result you achieve, between the choice to stay and the reward for staying. Those tools worked on rational problems. They worked on things that could be trained for, prepared for, met with a plan, addressed by showing up at 5:30 in the morning and doing the work that the work required. They did not work on this. This was not a training problem. This was not something you could out-prepare. This was time which was the one opponent his discipline had never been able to fully engage, which operated on a schedule that had no regard for his schedule, which was going to do what it was going to do regardless of how early he arrived and how long he stayed, and how completely he committed to the work. He had always known this. He had not known it like this. The phone call came on a Thursday morning in October, and it came from a journalist. Not the threatening kind, not the kind with a document or a story he hadn't agreed to tell, but the ordinary kind, the kind that arrived with a request rather than a revelation, with the polite and professional approach of someone who wanted to talk about his legacy. The word arrived in the conversation early in the second sentence after the pleasantries. Legacy. The journalist said it with a warmth that was genuine, said it as though the word was a compliment, as though being a person about whose legacy there was something worth discussing was an unambiguous good, a marker of significance and permanence, and the kind of impact that outlasts the moment. Ronaldo held the phone and listened to the word and felt the thing the word did, which was not the thing the journalist intended it to do. Legacy was the past tense. Legacy was what you had when the present was over. Legacy was the category into which things were moved when they had finished happening, when the immediate reality of them had been replaced by the retrospective reality, when the current argument had been resolved, and what remained was the historical verdict, fixed and permanent, and no longer available for revision by any further act or performance or mourning on an empty pitch. He had been receiving the word for years, had heard it in interviews and award ceremonies, and the kind of retrospective documentaries that get made about athletes while the athletes are still competing, that arrive with the implicit suggestion that the story has reached the point where it can be assessed, where the arc is visible enough to describe, where the person has become historical enough to be explained rather than simply experienced. He had received it each time with aversion, graciously, humbly, with the appropriate acknowledgement of gratitude and perspective, and had filed it, each time, in the category of things that were about someone slightly different from him, a more completed version, a more finished version, the version that existed in retrospect rather than in the present tense of a man who was still on the pitch at 5:30 in the morning and had not finished. But it was arriving more frequently now. And the frequency was its own kind of message. He thanked the journalist, declined the interview, and put his phone down, and went to training, because training was still the answer, training was still the place where the present tense was most available, most accessible, most capable of drowning out the other thing, and he trained for 2 hours and 40 minutes, longer than the session required, longer than his body required, with the specific quality of intensity that the youth coaches had described years ago in the language of weight, of something being carried without being put down. And that was still that thing, was more that thing now than it had ever been. He called no one about the fear. This was the obvious decision and also the most expensive one, and he made it in the same automatic, unexamined way that he had made all the decisions of this category across 30 years. By default, by the deep groove of a habit that had been installed so early and maintained so continuously that it no longer presented itself as a choice. You did not say the fear out loud. You did not give it to another person. You held it, you carried it, you converted it. That was the system. That was what you did with the things that threatened the wall. You used them, you turned them into fuel, you took the thing that could have broken you, and you ran it through the machine that made the breaking impossible, that transformed the raw material of fear and loss and the threat of the ending into the energy that produced the results that proved the ending hadn't come yet, that the present tense was still present, that the name was still current. He had been doing this for 30 years. The machine was very good at it. But machines that run continuously without maintenance accumulate where that doesn't appear in the output, that exists in the structure rather than the performance, that is invisible to external inspection and visible only to the person inside the machine, only to the person who can feel the specific, subtle, increasing resistance that comes with running something at maximum capacity for longer than it was designed to run, longer than anyone had designed anything to run in conditions that no one had fully anticipated when the design was made. He felt the resistance. He continued anyway. Because what was the alternative? Because stopping was not in the operating manual. Because the morning was coming and the pitch was waiting and the ball would do what the ball always did, and the work would produce the result, and the result would be evidence, and the evidence would answer the question that the fear was asking, would say, not yet, not today, the present tense is still present, the name is still current, the story is still being written. He just had to keep writing it. He just had to not stop. The moment that broke something open arrived without warning and without drama, in the specific way that the most important moments tend to arrive, not as events but as ordinary instances of ordinary things that happen to contain, on a particular day in a particular state of readiness, a charge they don't always carry, a weight they don't always have, a quality that on any other day would have passed through without leaving a mark, and that on this day left a mark that didn't go away. He was watching a youth match. Not his son's, a different match, at a different academy, the kind of routine attendance that came with his public role, the appearances at the grassroots level that his foundation required, and that he genuinely valued, and that on most days were straightforward, were the kind of obligation that was also an honest pleasure, that connected him to a version of the game that existed at the level of pure appetite, before the money and the management, and the continuous performance of importance had accrued to it. The boy was 11, perhaps 12, small for his age, but with the specific quality of movement that distinguishes the players who will make it from the players who won't, the quality of intention of the ball being not a thing to be moved but a problem to be solved, the relationship with it that is older than coaching and is either there or isn't. He was good. Genuinely good. The kind of good that was visible even to people who weren't looking for it, that had a legibility across the ordinary intelligence of a crowd of parents and youth coaches and the other children on the bench. At halftime, someone, a parent, standing nearby, leaned toward the boy and said something. The boy's face changed. He looked across the touchline to where Ronaldo was standing with two members of staff, in the half-aware, unfocused way of children receiving information about famous people they have been told are present, the way that names translate into faces at a delay rather than instantaneously, the way that recognition assembles itself piece by piece rather than arriving whole. The boy looked. He looked for longer than a moment, long enough to constitute the kind of looking that is processing rather than glancing, that is doing something with what it sees, that is constructing a relationship between the information it has received and the reality in front of it. Then he turned back to his teammates and said something, and there was a brief burst of reaction from the group. Interest, some pointing, the social amplification that children perform when one of them has brought something notable to the collective attention. And then they went back to what they were doing. The halftime snacks. The coach's instructions. The conversation between 11-year-olds that has its own urgent and self-sufficient agenda that is not about anything that exists outside the immediate circle of their lives and their friendships, and the match that was about to restart. Ronaldo watched them go back to it. He watched the boy, the good one, the one with the quality of intention, pick up his water bottle and talk to the player beside him about something that had nothing to do with the famous man on the touchline, and he felt something that arrived quietly and without announcement, and that settled into his chest with a permanence that told him, in the immediate way of certain kinds of knowledge, that it was not going to leave quickly. The boy had looked. The boy had registered the information. The boy had gone back to his water bottle. And it was not the going back that did it. It was what the going back revealed, what it suggested about the relationship between the information and the world of the boy, about the place that the name occupied in that world, which was not the place it would have occupied 15 years ago, Not the place it would have occupied in the world of an 11-year-old from 15 years ago for whom the name was not historical but current, not a monument but an event, not something that had happened, but something that was happening, something that was in the immediate, ongoing, present-tense conversation of a child's football world, rather than in the more distant conversation of record books and legacies, and the things that people older than you talk about with a reverence that is the reverence of retrospect. He was in the retrospect. He was in the reverence. He was becoming the kind of thing that people looked at and acknowledged, and went back to their water bottles. He drove home alone, which was not unusual, and he didn't turn on the radio, which was not unusual either, and the city moved past the windows in the way it always did, with its indifference and its beauty and its complete lack of interest in what was happening inside the car, and he arrived home and sat in the driveway for longer than 11 minutes this time, for perhaps 25, without going inside, and without examining too carefully why he wasn't going inside, because examining it would have required naming it, and naming it would have made it more real than he was prepared for it to be tonight. He thought about a wall. Not the wall he had built, though he thought about that too, but an actual wall, a physical wall, one he had seen once in Madeira, years ago, on a visit back to the island that had become increasingly rare and increasingly weighted as the years accumulated, each return heavier than the last with the specific gravity of time and absence and the complicated relationship between the person you were and the place that made you. It was a wall beside a football pitch, a local pitch, amateur, the kind with painted lines that faded and goalposts that needed attention, a wall that people had been writing on for years, adding names and dates, and the specific small monuments that people leave in the places where they were happy, where something important to them happened, where they want to mark the fact of their having been there. His name was on it. Had been on it since he was a teenager, since someone from the neighborhood had put it there in the years when he was first becoming a name worth putting on walls, and it had survived the decades through some combination of luck and weather and the specific durability of pain applied with conviction, and he had seen it on the last visit, and had felt something that he had not fully processed at the time, and that was returning to him now. In the driveway, in the dark. The wall was full. Around his name were other names. Names of other players, other local heroes, other people who had been significant in that specific world and at that specific scale, names that meant nothing outside the neighborhood and everything inside it, names whose owners were now adults doing other things in other places or were still here, were still part of the fabric of that hill and that street and those painted lines. His name was larger than the others, was in a different category of size and placement, was clearly the name that the wall had been organized around in the years after it appeared. But it was surrounded. It was in the company of all the other names, contained by the same physical space, subject to the same weathering, occupying the same wall. He had looked at it and thought at the time that it was moving, the fact of being on a wall with the local names, the continuity with the place, the evidence that the neighborhood remembered. He had thought it was moving and had not examined what else it was, what else it contained beneath the sentiment, until now, until the driveway, until the boy with the water bottle. The wall was also evidence of time. The names on it were evidence of the past. The wall was where things went when they were over, when the present had moved on, and what remained was the inscription, the fixed and permanent and no longer current record of what had once been happening, and was now in the past tense. The wall was beautiful. The wall was also the past tense made physical. He got out of the car. He stood in the driveway in the dark and breathed and tried, with the tools he had, to name what he was feeling, not to manage it, not yet, just to see it clearly enough to understand its shape, because understanding the shape of a thing was always the first step, even when the shape was not one you wanted to see, even when the seeing was the hardest part. What he was feeling was grief. Not the grief of loss. Not yet. Nothing was lost yet. The career was still happening, the present tense was still present, but something prior to that, something that preceded the loss and was perhaps inseparable from it. The grief of understanding that it was coming, that no amount of 5:30 mornings or 2-hour 40-minute training sessions or disciplined management of every variable within his control was going to stop it from coming, that the wall in Madeira was waiting, that the past tense was patient, that time had all the time in the world, and he did not. He stood in the driveway, he breathed. He went inside. He told his son. Not that night. Not immediately, not in the reactive, unprocessed way of someone who has just been broken open and is sharing the breaking before they understand what is broken. He waited. He let the days pass and let the feeling settle and let the understanding that had arrived in the driveway complete its work, find its edges, become something he could hold and turn and examine from more than one direction before giving it to another person. He waited 3 weeks. And then on a Tuesday afternoon, the Tuesday afternoons had become a fixture now, had become the time that was reserved for the conversations that went somewhere real. He told his son what had been happening. He told it without the version, without the management, in the plain language that this room and this relationship had slowly, over time, made available to him. Told him about Dubai and the charity dinner and the youth match and the boy with the water bottle and the wall in Madeira and the driveway. Told all of it in the order it had happened and with the specific texture of how it had felt from the inside, which was the part that the version had never provided, and that his son was the only person in the world he trusted to receive. Cristiano listened in the way he always listened in these conversations, with the quality of attention that was his father's attention, the focused and specific and fully committed quality that brought all of its capacity to bear on what was in front of it, that didn't divide, didn't wander, didn't perform listening but actually listened, actually received, actually did the work of being present for what was being said. When Ronaldo finished, Cristiano was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I tell you something?" "Yes." "When I was at school," Cristiano said, slowly, choosing the words with care, "the younger kids, the ones who were 8, 9 years old, some of them didn't know who you were. Not the way the older kids did. They knew the name, but it was like knowing the name of a country you've never been to. They knew it was important, but they didn't feel why it was important." He paused. "And I used to find that, not painful exactly, but something. I didn't have a word for what it was." "What was it?" Ronaldo said. "I think it was the beginning of understanding what you actually are," Cristiano said. "Not what you are to me, what you are to the world. And those are different things." He looked at his father. "To the world you're a name that's becoming historical. And that's frightening to you, because you think historical means over." He paused again. "But to me you're not historical at all. To me you're the most present thing there is. You're the most current thing there is." His voice was steady and careful and entirely without performance. "And I don't know if this helps, but I think the people who matter most to you, the people whose recognition actually reaches you, the people whose knowing you actually feels like being known, those people don't have the problem you're describing. The people who know you, not just the noun, they're not forgetting. They're not going anywhere." Ronaldo sat with this. He sat with it for a long time. "But what about after?" he said finally. "What about when none of this is happening anymore? What about when the career is over and the name is historical and there's no more present tense to point to?" Cristiano looked at him with a directness that had always been there, that had been his since childhood, the willingness to look at things without blinking that was his own quality rather than a borrowed one. "Then the question is, what was it for?" he said. "If it was for the recognition, if the recognition was the thing you were building toward, then yes, the ending is the ending. And the forgetting is the cost of the ending, and there's nothing to be done about that." He paused. "But if it was for something else, if the 30 years and the 5:30 mornings and all of it were for something that lives in the work itself rather than in the world's awareness of the work, then the forgetting doesn't touch it. It's not located in the recognition. It can't be taken by the forgetting." Ronaldo was quiet. "What was it for?" Cristiano said. Not asking for an answer, exactly. Asking him to ask himself. And Ronaldo thought about the bathroom floor in Carrington. He thought about a pitch in Madeira, with a father on the touchline feeling something for which he had no name. He thought about every 5:30 morning and every honest touch of the ball in an empty stadium and every moment in the work that had nothing to do with the cameras and everything to do with the specific, private, irreducible relationship between what he could do and what he chose to do with it, the relationship that existed regardless of the audience, that would have existed in an empty field with no one watching, that was probably most purely itself in an empty field with no one watching. He thought about what that was for. He thought it was for itself. It was always for itself. The recognition was the evidence that it was real, but the thing was real before the evidence. Was real without the evidence, was real in the way that things are real when they exist in you rather than in other people's awareness of you. He said, "I think I confuse the evidence with a thing." Cristiano nodded slowly. "I think a lot of people do," he said. The fear did not disappear after that Tuesday afternoon. This is not that kind of story. Not the kind where a conversation resolves something that 30 years of living had accumulated, where words do work that only time and experience can do, where the insight provides the cure. The fear was real and it remained real, and it continued to arrive in the familiar places, the airports, the occasional face that didn't change, the growing frequency of the demographic shift in the recognition response. And it continued to require management, continued to cost something, continued to exist in the background of days that were otherwise full and productive and, by any external measure, still extraordinary. But something about its quality changed. Not its presence, but its meaning. Not its frequency, but its weight. Because the Tuesday afternoon had done something specific that no amount of training or performance or result could have done. It had moved the thing that the fear was about from one location to another, from the outside of him to the inside, from the world's awareness of the work to the work itself, and in that relocation the fear had lost a specific quality that it had previously had, the quality of threatening something he couldn't defend, something that existed outside the reach of his will and his discipline and his continuous, exhausting, total commitment to the work. The work was inside. The work was his. The world's awareness of it was not his, had never been his, was borrowed, was always going to be temporary, was always going to be subject to the processes of time and the shifting attention of the world, and the inevitable demographic mathematics of a fame that had peaked in a specific era and would recede, as all fame receded, as all present tenses became past tenses, as the wall in Madeira accumulated its weathering and its company. That was fine. He was beginning to understand how it was supposed to be. The work was not on the wall. The work was not in the recognition. The work was in the body and the will, and the 30 years of 5:30 mornings that had produced something real and permanent, and entirely independent of whether anyone was looking at it or naming it or writing about its legacy or carrying it in their memory or putting it in the past tense or the present or any tense at all. He went to training. He was there before the lights came on. He was there when the pitch was empty and the stadium was dark and the city was not yet awake and there was no camera and no audience and no recognition response and no name and no version, just the ball and the work and the specific honest conversation between what he could do and what he chose to do with it, the conversation that had been going on since Madeira, that was still going on, that would go on for as long as he was willing to show up and continue it. He took the first touch. The ball went exactly where he told it to go. He was alone. He was entirely, perfectly, irreducibly present. Nobody was watching. It didn't matter. It had never mattered. It had always mattered. Both of those things were true. Both of those things were going to remain true. He kept working. The wall in Madeira still stands. His name is still on it, in the paint applied with conviction by someone who was there at the beginning and wanted to mark it, faded now, the decades having done their patient work on the pigment and the surface, the letters softer at their edges than they were, the specific bright certainty of new paint having become something quieter and more weathered, and in some ways more permanent for the weathering, the way that things become permanent when time has tested them, and they have remained. Around it, the other names, the local names, the names that mean everything in their specific world and nothing outside it, the names of people who played on that pitch because they loved the game, because the game was available to them, because the pitch was there, and the afternoon was there, and the ball was there, and that was enough. That was always going to be enough. That was the reason the game existed before the stadiums and the cameras and the recognition responses and the legacies and the walls that turned present tenses into past. Somewhere on that pitch, on a morning or an afternoon or an evening that has no particular date attached to it, a boy is playing. Not famous. Not going anywhere specific. Not the subject of any scout's report or any documentary or any carefully managed interview about his legacy. Just playing, in the way that children play when no one has told them yet that playing is a means to an end rather than an end in itself. When the ball and the afternoon and the pitch are the whole story, the complete story, the only story that needs to be told. He moves with an intention that is legible from a distance. The ball goes where he tells it. The afternoon continues. The wall holds. The names remain. He retired on a Thursday in March, in a statement that was 3 paragraphs long and contained no performance, no version, no carefully managed language designed to shape how the ending was received. Just the facts. The date, the decision, the gratitude. The statement was released at 7 in the morning, before the news cycle had warmed up, before the apparatus of commentary and analysis and retrospective assessment had time to assemble itself and begin the work of turning the present tense definitively into the past. He was at training when it went out. He had been there since 5:30. He stayed until 9. Nobody was there when he arrived. Nobody was there when he left. The pitch was exactly as it always was. The grass, the lines, the goals, the specific quality of early morning silence that had been the most consistent thing in his life for 30 years, more consistent than any result or any recognition or any version of himself that the world had held and then put down. He stood at the center circle for a moment before he left.